and when we come to these biblical stories, they're also seen through art and history, through interpretation. So all of this is inside of us in one way or another, these creation stories. And certainly they've been important in Jewish life. I mean, Orthodox Jewish life is more patriarchal, and as again we go across the spectrum, less so in modern interpretations. But again, these are stories, and I think it's important for us to be able to look at the narrative as central to our being, but also be able to critically evaluate the history behind it. So for instance, I've never seen a burning bush that isn't consumed, if the fire is strong enough.
Right.
I mean, but that can be central to my life, even though I can have doubts about its truthfulness in the story.
Central in what respect?
Well, I don't know how to, first of all, the Exodus. Modern historians have great doubts about the Exodus story. We could go to the Passion of Jesus and say many Christian scholars have questions, or some Christian scholars have questions about the truthfulness of the Passion story. Did it happen? I don't know. Were these tribes in Egypt, all of them? Doubt it. Were any of them in Egypt? It's a question. So the whole truthfulness of Scripture, Hebrew Bible or Christian Bible, or what I call the Older Testament and the Old Testament, coming back to one of my favorite things.
Yeah.
And today we're starting to read Buber in My Modern Judaism, and he was a biblical scholar, a great biblical scholar, and he said it's not a question of whether these events actually happened. It was how they could express formative events that happened to them. Now, we can't express it that way today. We have other ways of expressing it. And we have to express our thou experiences as well. They can never really be the experience. So these narratives are very deep within me as a Jew. But I'm also able to look at them and even chuckle about their historical facticity. Well, Moses is much more important. Again, historically, who Moses was, I don't know. But and this concentration today on the Abrahamic faiths in terms of interfaith, I really don't go much there. It's sort of a very kind of abstract spirituality. Now, Abraham is important, obviously, too, and I'm fascinated, especially with Abraham's discussion or argument or disputation with God over Sodom and Gomorrah. I think about that a lot. I was in a synagogue in South Africa where I gave a talk, and the reading that day from the Torah was on this disputation with God. And I hadn't, this one part, of course I knew, Abraham says to God, who Abraham's just met.
Right.
Yeah, and he's met in the form of folks who come to visit him. Yeah, so that hospitality, the tent, very interesting. And Abraham says, when God tells him that he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham thinks, well, what are you talking about? And appeals to God. You're a just God, you're this great God, you're going to destroy this whole city, but there may be righteous people there. And he goes back and forth. He says 50, 45, 47. Yeah, and so he doesn't stop. But the line before that, depending on one's interpretation, is God wonders whether he should tell Abraham about this. Now, why would God, this all-powerful God, even think about telling or not telling this lowly human being? And my interpretation is that God realizes that Abraham has a conscience.
Conscience, would you label conscience almost some type of intrinsic faith? Or more conscience along the line of knowing right from wrong?
No, I think, well, that's an interesting point. Knowing right from wrong, but also being able to speak to God about that and also question God about God's justice. You know, this is part of the covenantal aspect that's so interesting in Jewish life and quite different than in Christian life, at least as it's evolved.
Sure.
That Jews have a power within the covenant to call God to account. So God is, at least in this biblical passage, just seems to be saying, geez, I don't know if I should tell Abraham. So God, again, depending on one's interpretation, God seems to be, God seems to say to himself, I think Abraham's going to have something to say about this. Well, that's an interesting conception of God. That God is already reflecting about what Abraham might say to him, which might make sense to God and might challenge God's own justice.